Perhaps no effect is more sought after than the look of shallow depth of field. When the subject is in sharp focus and the background is out of focus, the look just says movie. Unfortunately, the effect is quite difficult to achieve on a small CCD camcorder. There's a reason that the shallow depth of field look reminds people of the movies. It's because you can usually only ever see this look in the movies. In this DVD, we'll show you some techniques you can use to get the very shallowest depth of field the DVX can deliver, and some ways to get that look even when it would otherwise be impossible. First, let's explain what depth of field is. A lens can only focus on one plane in space at any one time. There's really only one infinitely thin plane that's ever truly in focus. Everything closer to the lens or further from the lens will be progressively more and more out of focus. But there's a certain distance from that plane where objects are still acceptably sharp. That distance, that area in front and behind the in-focus point, is called the depth of field. It's interesting to note that the depth of field is not equally split. It extends for 1/3 of the distance in front of the subject and 2/3 behind it. That means it's easier to get objects out of focus in the foreground than it is to get them out of focus in the background. Depth of field is controlled by three primary factors: distance to the subject, focal length, and aperture, also called iris or f-stop. By changing any of these factors, you can deepen or narrow the depth of field. Some are more important than others, and some cancel each other out. For example, getting closer to the subject will make for shallower depth of field. However, in order to get the same subject size, you have to zoom out, and zooming out to a wide-angle shot makes for deeper depth of field. The two cancel each other out, and for any given subject size, the more telephoto the shot, the shallower the depth of field will appear to be. In this shot, the camera was set at maximum wide angle and moved close enough so the subject fills the frame. In this shot, we zoomed into full telephoto and then moved the camera back enough that the subject is the same size. But the background is noticeably more out of focus in the telephoto shot. Obviously, telephoto is a crucial component in getting the look of shallow depth of field. While the optics and laws regarding depth of field are complex, for most circumstances, there are really only two factors you need to pay attention to: f-stop and zoom setting. And even then, to get the shallowest depth of field possible, you usually only have to remember two numbers, f2.8 and z99. Treat your camera as if it has only one aperture, f2.8, and the zoom is stuck at maximum telephoto, z99, and you're well on your way to getting the shallowest depth of field the camera can deliver. First, let's look at zoom setting. One of the key factors in getting the shallow depth of field look is to get a long telephoto lens. Unfortunately, the DVX's maximum telephoto is fairly mild, at only 45 millimeters. To get shallow depth of field shots, you need to use all the telephoto you can get. Lock that lens at Z99, and if you need to adjust the framing of your shot, do it by moving the camera, not by zooming out. Even zooming out a little bit may ruin the shallow depth of field look you're trying so hard to create. You can also get a telephoto extender lens from Century Precision Optics that will give you even more telephoto reach. Also, aperture is crucially important. You want the aperture as wide open as you can get it. On the DVX, when zoomed all the way in, that means f2.8. If your shot is overexposed at f2.8, don't stop down the lens. Instead, engage the neutral density filters to bring the exposure back where it should be. If you need more control over the exposure, get an external 1-stop and 2-stop ND filter, also called an ND.3 and an ND.6. These combined with the camera's built-in filters will give you the ability to control exposure to f2.8 under almost any lighting conditions. Once you have your camera set at f2.8 and Z99, and you've moved the camera so that your framing is appropriate and you've set the neutral density filters so that the exposure is correct, there are a few more tricks you can employ to get the shallowest depth of field possible. First, remember that the depth of field extends for 1/3 in front of the subject and 2/3 behind it. We can take advantage of that to try to slide the whole zone of depth of field closer to the camera and further away from the background. Try to focus as close as possible, getting the smallest MF number you can, while maintaining acceptable sharpness on your subject. This is a cheat that will help shorten the perceived depth of field. Second, a very effective technique is to cheat the background away from your subject. Just because you want your subject to be staged in front of, for example, a bookcase, doesn't mean she actually has to be right next to it. Separate your subject as far away as possible from the background, and you can force the background outside the depth of field and push it further out of focus. Whenever possible, stage your shots so the subject is as far as you can get from the background, even if that means cheating the shot or staging the shot such that the background is across the street. In tight quarters, it gets very difficult to achieve the shallow depth of field look. At some point, you have to acknowledge that this just isn't a 35mm movie camera. It's a 1/3 inch CCD video camera, and there's only so far you can push it. But we're not ready to give up yet. First, if the room is so small that you simply cannot use Z99 to frame your shot, you can try going close instead. Zoom out and get as absolutely close to the subject as you can. Getting extremely close will narrow the depth of field, also expand the background, and allow you to open up the iris some. This technique really only works for extreme close-up shots, but it can be effective. If you like to be able to zoom in while getting close, you can add a high-quality achromatic diopter lens, like the Nikon 5T, which will let you focus closer while zoomed. Opening the iris and getting closer will compensate for some of the loss from not being able to zoom all the way in. You can also try using a green screen to force the background out of focus. This is not really an easy or practical solution, but if you need the background out of focus and can't do it any other way, you can try this. Shoot your subject in the same place and same light as if the green screen wasn't there. Then remove the green screen and the subject and shoot a background shot as out of focus as you want. Then in post, you can combine them for a fairly convincing soft background. Green screen is hard to pull off well with a DV camera, so we're not recommending this technique, but we're showing it to you so you know what your options are. In summary, for shallow depth of field, remember these 4 things: Z99, f2.8, get as close as you can, and get the subject as far from the background as possible.
The DVX is a revolutionary camera for bringing 24p shooting capability to the indie filmmaker and prosumer video shooter. Finally, there's a camera that promises footage that looks like film rather than like video. But can a video camera really deliver the look of something shot on film? To find out, we shot these scenes on the DVX in 24p mode and also on 16mm film. The DVX footage certainly looks a lot more like film than regular video would. Does DVX footage really look like film? You be the judge. With a little tweaking in post, the look comes even closer. It may not look exactly like film, but for many people, it comes close enough. The DVX is the first prosumer camera to offer a shooting speed of 24p, but it can also shoot at 30p as well as 60i. And with a little manipulation in post, you can get 12p and 15p too. These frame rates give you flexibility that's previously only been available to film shooters. In film, slow motion is shot by running the camera at a faster frame rate. Film normally runs at 24 frames per second, but for slow motion, the cameraman might shoot it at, say, 48 frames per second. When those 48 frames are played back at the 24 frame per second speed, it'll take twice as long to play back, so everything will be moving at half speed. Shooting at a faster frame rate is called overcranking, because in the early days, cinematographers would actually crank the film faster. The DVX is the first prosumer camera to offer the ability to actually overcrank, the same way a film camera does. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you can shoot your slow motion shots in 30p at 30 frames per second. In post, you then play that 30p footage at 80% speed, and you get frame for frame accurate slow motion, just like overcranking a film camera. It's very mild slow motion, about 25% slower, but it's the cleanest slow motion possible from a video camera. For slower slow motion, you should shoot interlaced video at 60i. In 60i mode, the DVX shoots 60 frames per second, but they're not full frames, they're fields, which are only half resolution. But what's important about slow motion is that it's smooth. And to get the smoothest slow motion, you need to capture as many motion samples as possible. Interlaced mode captures 60 motion samples per second. When you import that footage into a 24p timeline, you slow it down to 40% of its speed, and your editing program will make a full frame out of each field. Even though the frames are lower resolution, the result is glass-smooth, slow motion. When shooting 60i for slow motion, you'll want to use a higher shutter speed. Set the shutter speed to 1/120th of a second to simulate the look a film camera would give if it was shooting at 60 frames per second. Now, what about fast motion? With a little manipulation in post, the DVX can deliver the look of a film camera shooting at 12 or 15 frames per second. To get 12p, set your shutter speed to 1/24th of a second and shoot in 24p mode. Then in post, speed up your footage to play back twice as fast. The result will be 12 individual frames, exactly matching the motion of film shot at 12 frames per second. For 15p, set your shutter speed at 1/30th of a second and shoot in 30p mode. When you bring it into your 24p timeline, play the footage back at 160% speed. That will give you 15 distinct frames, just like a film camera that shot at 15 frames per second. Using these techniques, your DVX can act like a mini VariCam, shooting at frame rates of 12, 15, 24, 30, and 60 frames per second.
The DVX is a great camera, but it's still only standard definition video. Affordable high-definition camcorders are starting to become available. The first on the market was the JVC HD1. We put the DVX and the HD1 side by side and shot the same scenes. Because high definition is always 16:9, we used the anamorphic adapter with the DVX to make it more comparable. For color, contrast, latitude, and overall image quality, the DVX is clearly superior. But for resolution and image sharpness, there's no contest. The high-definition camera is much sharper than the DVX. Part of this is due to the much higher resolution of high def, but part of it is due to the strong edge enhancement of the HD1 camera. The DVX footage actually has the detail level turned down so it looks softer than it otherwise could. When viewed at standard definition, the JVC is being held to a disadvantage. It is, after all, a high-definition camera, so we decided to test up-resing the DVX by the same resolution as the JVC, using PhotoZoom Pro software. We extracted a standard def patch out of the high-def frame so you can see the full resolution on your television. The up-resed DVX footage is surprisingly competitive with the JVC's native high-def footage. Obviously, the high-def camera is higher in resolution, but the up-res DVX comes close, while still delivering the superior color, latitude, contrast, and all the other image attributes that make the DVX picture so good. A very popular software program is the Orphanage's Magic Bullet. Magic Bullet lets you apply different looks to your video, like you're seeing now. A free limited copy comes with the new editing programs like Sony's Vegas and Adobe's Premiere. We thought it would be interesting to see what kinds of looks we could create in the camera using just the camera's settings. We'll show you before and after and the settings we used, so you can duplicate these looks or use them as a starting point to create looks of your own.
Another way to get shallow depth of field with the DVX is to use the P&S Technic Mini 35 adapter. The Mini 35 lets you use lenses that are made for 35mm cameras and get the same shallow depth of field possible with a 35mm movie camera. In addition, the Mini 35 softens the image and adds a subtle texture and glow that make the footage look very much like 35mm movie film. Here's an example of the DVX shot with the anamorphic adapter versus the DVX shot with the Mini 35. The anamorphic footage is much sharper, but the Mini 35 footage is definitely more film-like. The Mini 35 is a quite expensive accessory, costing approximately $10,000, so you may want to consider just renting it for shots where extremely shallow depth of field is critically important to you.
The DVX cameras feature an incredible range of image control settings, including settings that control color, detail level, black level, tint, gamma, color matrix, resolution, and even frame rate. With so many choices and options, how do you know what setting to use and when? There isn't any magic formula. You have to experiment, find what you like best, and tweak the settings until you get the look you want. In this section, we'll show you what settings do, so you'll know which to change for the effect you're looking for. We'll use the extreme values of maximum and minimum, so it will be easier to see what they do.
This clip serves as a baseline reference point. This is scene file 0, all settings set to 0, normal gamma, normal matrix, and this is 24p mode in thick line detail. This is a reference point that we'll use to compare all other scene file settings to. The detail level setting controls edge enhancement and the appearance of overall sharpness of the picture. With detail set all the way down to -7, you can see that the image is noticeably blurry. Watch what happens when we set detail up to +7. Setting a higher detail level brings in edge enhancement, which is an artificial video sharpening that can look unnatural and can introduce artifacting into your videos. Look at the artifacts that crop up around the fine print on the priority mailbox, up in the resolution chart. With detail, it's probably best to avoid the extremes. -7 is pretty blurry, and +7 shows some artifacting. The smaller the detail number, the softer and more organic your image is going to look. The larger the detail number, the sharper and more electronic it'll look. Detail really seems to come into play somewhere around -5. You can start to see the edge enhancements starting to crop up. At 0, it's actually kind of strong. But if you're aiming for a small screen display and you want sharp, +7 looks pretty sharp. 0 actually looks pretty sharp. If you're going to be blowing it up to film or something like that, you want to use smaller detail level numbers to minimize the edge enhancement that crops into the picture. V detail level is a similar setting to the detail level control, but it primarily enhances the contrast between horizontal lines. Look at the small DV tapes in the center of the screen, and you'll see that the lines, the horizontal lines that delineate the edges of the tapes, with V detail off, they're kind of muted, but with it on, they really pop nice and white. Now, the V detail level has an overall sharpening effect. You can tell in the giraffe's fur. With it off, it's a little softer. With it on, it's a little sharper. It's a similar sharpening effect to detail level, but much milder. And whereas regular detail level actually adds an outline on high contrast edges, V detail level doesn't really add any outline. It just seems to enhance any existing outline. So if you use V detail level when the regular detail level is off, or -7, you really won't see much of any effect at all. In this scene, I have V detail level set to -7 and overall detail level is +7 to give it as much sharpening effect as possible, to show as much edge enhancement as possible, and that's why you're seeing a difference. But if you had your detail level set to -7, then almost no matter how much V detail level you put in, it really won't show anything, because V detail level really seems to affect the sharpening outline that regular detail level introduces into the picture. Detail coring applies a slight smoothing effect to your video, especially to the noisy areas. The higher the detail coring setting, the more it will blend noisy areas together. If you look and see the overall effect of the noise, this is at -7, which is basically no detail coring being applied. And that's at +7, which it really smooths out like the shadow areas to the right of the giraffe. It's a very mild effect, but it definitely helps to smooth out the noise. We have the detail level, the overall detail level set to maximum because high detail level really brings out the noise in the picture. Detail level actually sharpens the edges of the noise and makes it more visible, which makes it easier to see the effect of detail coring. Now at -7, detail coring has practically no effect on the noise, no smoothing. But at +7, it has a significant effect, and it really smooths up the noise in the video signal. The higher you set the detail coring setting, the more smoothing you'll see, and at higher levels, it can lead to your picture looking a little softer. Overall, it looks so slightly softer and out of focus versus, you know, the sharper detail. But this is actually, with the +7, it looks a little artificial looking, so the smoothing is actually a nice effect. Chroma level dictates how saturated or how muted the colors are in your picture. This is at chroma level 0. If we go to -7, there's a drop-off in color saturation. It's a little more pastel, a little more flat. If you go to +7, colors really pop. You can really see this in the color chart, the bar chart in the center, or on the green filter case at the bottom of the picture. At -7, colors are nice and flat. At +7, very saturated, very powerful. Chroma phase is kind of like the tint control on an NTSC television. Basically, it lets you balance your color palette towards either the yellowish green side of the spectrum or towards the magenta purple side of the spectrum. But the effect is really mild. Watch the color chart. The chart is blue, then cyan, then green, then yellow, red, and magenta. If you look at the yellow, red, magenta, you'll see probably the most effect. Here we're at 0. Here we'll go to -7. And -7 shifts the entire color palette a little bit towards the yellow or towards the green. There's an overall tint or cast to the picture. Now we'll go all the way +7. Watch the magenta really pop on the right. Now the magenta is purple, whereas prior it's kind of orangish and really not that distinct from the red. So when you go to a +7, it really tints everything a little towards purple. When you go -7, it moves everything towards the yellowish green. You'll see actually that the yellow color looks a little greenish here, whereas in neutral, it's more of a vibrant yellow. Again, it's a very mild effect, but it is a way that you can tint your color one way or the other. Color temp is a control that lets you control the color cast of your picture, sort of like color phase does, but to a much stronger degree and on a different axis. Color temp lets you adjust the color balance between the orange side of the spectrum and the blue side of the spectrum. So if you go on the negative, it will tint everything towards the orangey red, more like tungsten light is on the Kelvin color scale. If you go to the positive side, everything tints towards the blues. Now, filter companies will sell warming filters like an 812 to change the tone of your shot. You can actually use the color temp to warm or cool down just like a warming or cooling filter, but it's free because it's actually inside the camera. Another product that's sold for warming images is called warm cards, but you can get a very similar effect for free just by using the color temp function. You have 7 settings. There's a large degree of control. I'm showing the extremes so that you can actually see really what it does. One thing to note though, this menu item only works when you're using manual white balance or if you're using automatic white balance. If you use a preset, the 3.2K or the 5.6K preset, it will not work. It has no effect. You have to be in manual white balance or automatic white balance in order for this setting to influence the picture. The master pedestal control confuses a lot of people, but in practice it's a very powerful image control, and when you see it back to back, it's really easy to see what it actually does. Basically, the master pedestal governs the overall contrast of your picture. The lower you set the master pedestal, the more dark items will all blend together into black, giving you stronger, harsher contrast. The higher you set the master pedestal, the more the contrast washes out and the overall contrast will look softer and flatter, but you'll also preserve more detail in the picture. Now look at the dark section, the dark gray section of the color chip chart. At a master pedestal of positive 15, which is what we're at now, you can clearly and easily discern all the individual gray chips. But when we switch to negative 15, the bottom 3 or 4 all get crushed down to black. You lose all the detail in there, but you get much stronger contrast, a much harsher picture, and everything, it gets punchier and really draws out the image. Now, it doesn't really affect the upper end of the exposure very much. Look at the top 7 or 8 chips there, and when we switch back and forth, they don't really change. It really only affects the darker sections of the picture. For high contrast, moody shots, a lower master pedestal might be appropriate, and for the maximum exposure latitude, you might think about setting the master pedestal a little bit higher. The extremes are extreme. At positive 15, it almost looks like there's a gray cast, like a gray filter that's been put over the image. But at negative 15, everything is really crushed. And for reference, here's 0. This is what a normal image looks like. This is when we crush the master pedestal down as low as possible. And this is what it looks like when we drag it up as high as possible. The auto iris setting doesn't really change how your image looks per se. What it does is it tells the camera's exposure system that you want to overexpose or underexpose by a certain amount. The range is from -4 to +4, and each step accounts for about 1/3 of an f-stop. So here we're at 0, and this is what the camera thinks normal exposure should look like. If I set it to -4, everything darkens down by about 1.5 stops. And at +4, everything overexposes by about 1.5 stops. So if you know that you want a certain look, you can use the auto iris to help dial in what you think the exposure should be. However, be aware that this really only works when you're in auto exposure, of course. If you're set to manual iris, then this setting won't have any effect at all. The DVX100 offered 4 different gamma curves, which are low, normal, high, and cine gamma. The 100A adds 3 more of its own, which are cine like D, cine like V, and black press. We're going to show you what those gamma curves actually do. Basically, gamma curves control how brightness information is distributed in the picture. Don't really have an effect on color, just on how it handles brightness and dynamic range. Now with normal gamma, standard video looking pictures are produced, like what you're seeing here. When you switch to low gamma compresses some of the brighter parts of the picture while preserving the darker parts. So you keep all the detail in the darker parts, but you compress the higher parts a little. We'll go back to normal gamma, and then we'll go to low gamma. And what this means is that if you're looking to preserve detail in the shadow areas, you can use low gamma and then actually iris up a little bit, because the highs will be protected because you're using this certain gamma curve, so that the highs are being brought down some. So you can iris up a little, open up a little bit, get more detail in the dark section of the picture while not overexposing. When you switch to high gamma, it does kind of the opposite, which is that it brings up the brightness level of the dark parts of the picture, but leaves the higher level alone. So we're going to go from low to high. You can really see that there's a difference in the last 2 chips on the grayscale on the chip chart. In high gamma, you can clearly discern the difference between the 2. In low gamma, it's not as easy to discern. So this means that you can do the exact same thing. If you're trying to preserve detail in the high parts of the picture, you can switch to high gamma. And what that'll do is, because it protects the low parts, you can iris down a little bit and get more information in the high part of the picture without worrying about crushing all the dark levels together and having it blend into one big mush of dark gray or black. Now, cine gamma has a substantial effect on the overall image. And what cine gamma does, it compresses the overall contrast range. Everything about the picture is compressed and lowered. The brights are all brought down quite a bit, and more headroom is provided at the top of the scale. You can actually see that you'll get more latitude by using cine gamma. Watch the whitest colored chip. When we switch to cine gamma, you see that the camera can clearly resolve the difference between the whitest and the next whitest chips. Whereas in high gamma, there's not that much of a difference, but when we go to cine gamma, the difference really starts to be drawn out. You can see further into the higher end of the spectrum with cine gamma. It provides a little more latitude and provides for more range from the darkest dark to the brightest bright, but there's a potential drawback when you use Cine Gamma, which is that there's no knee protection at the top end of the scale. Now, in low, normal, and high gamma, overexposure is gently rolled off by this knee circuit, which makes for a smooth transition from bright to overexposed. In Cine Gamma, there is no knee. If something starts to overexpose, it'll just flat out blow out, and it looks pretty ugly. It's something that you want to avoid. But if you're careful and you prevent overexposure, then Cine Gamma will give you the most latitude that the camera can deliver. It has a characteristic soft contrast look to it because the whole contrast range is compressed and shrunk down. Now the DVX100A adds 3 additional gamma settings. The first we're going to look at is Cine D. Now Cine D does the same thing as Cine Gamma, but it's optimized to provide the most dynamic range you can get while still giving you knee protection. So what happens when you switch to Cine D is that the contrast range gets stretched out. So on Cine, everything is a lower, flatter contrast, and actually the overall picture is a little bit darker. But when you go to Cine D, it's like it grabs the entire contrast range and pulls it, stretches it higher to give you more range from the lowest low to the highest high. But it does that through applying gain to the signal, and so the result can be that you get a little bit more noise, but you do get the widest stretch of dynamic range. Cine V is similar to Cine, but it's optimized for contrast. It's optimized for a really stark difference between the darkest dark and the whitest white, not necessarily giving you more information in the picture, but giving you more contrast. So we'll go back to Cine, and you can see that everything is pretty much a soft, flat contrast. And go Cine V, and you get a lot sharper, punchier picture, but you actually get a little bit less detail because the dynamic range is stretched so far that more of the picture goes into overexposure, more of the darks crush down into underexposure. Whereas with Cine, you get overall the best range. It's just up to you to bring out the best in the picture when you use Cine Gamma. The last gamma setting we're going to talk about is black press. Now, black press is kind of like the low and high gammas in that it gives a normal video response, but it makes a little bit of room in the scale. Whereas high gamma makes room at the high end of the scale and pushes the darks down, and low gamma makes room at the low end of the scale and pushes the brights up. Black press gamma actually makes room in the middle of the scale. It presses the darks down a little bit and it leaves the lights alone and really makes room in the middle of the tonal range. So here we have normal gamma and there's black press. It doesn't have a lot of difference, but what it does is it frees up a little bit of room in the midtones. So normal gamma is a little bit washed out. Black press brings a little bit of contrast back to it by pushing down the middle of the scale in the darks and making more room that there's more ability to resolve information in the midtones of the picture. The knee setting is a new feature of the DVX100A. It helps you prevent overexposure. What it does is it determines the point where the camera starts rolling off the highest intensity or the brightest parts of the picture. The setting lets you decide what point the knee begins. At the low setting, it starts attenuating signals at 80% of maximum brightness. This is set at low setting now. At the high setting, it starts rolling off signals only when it sees 100%. This is high. Now where you can see the effect is in the fourth white chip chart. You can really see on low, it's still gray. On high, it's already let it get up to white before it started attenuating. So high will let you have the most unmodified signal, but low brings in the most dynamic range. And mid is right in the middle. Mid starts attenuating the signal at 90%. So using the knee is a way to extend your dynamic range. The lower you set it, the further you'll extend the dynamic range of the camera and prevent overexposure. The matrix settings let you choose different patterns of overall color response. The color matrix basically remaps the original colors onto a new matrix of colors. Now in normal, which is what we're showing here, it's basically mild normal response. If you switch over to the fluorescent matrix, you'll see that the colors are boosted on the red, yellow, cyan, and magenta. So we'll go back to normal. Now look at the boost that happens when we go to fluorescent. It brings up the overall color level, but it doesn't bring up the greens. And the reason why is because fluorescent lights frequently have a green cast or green spike to them. So this matrix is assuming that if you're shooting under fluorescent lights, the lights will be boosting the greens already, so they don't boost the colors. They boost the other colors to match the enhanced green that the fluorescent lights will be bringing. So normal, and then you can see fluorescent. Now there's also cine-like, and cine-like is basically the same as fluorescent, except they also add a boost to the greens and the blues. So in fluorescent, the blues and the greens aren't really boosted, but in cine-like, there's a significant boost to the greens. You can really see that in the color chip chart and also in the filter case at the bottom. We go back to fluorescent where the greens are actually even a little bit bluish, but when we switch over to cine-like, there's a big boost in the green saturation. The DVX100A adds another matrix setting which is called enriched. Enriched saturates the yellow, red, and magenta section of the color scale while having less of an effect on the blue, cyan, and green section. So normal, and then enriched. Enriched actually brings down the level of the green, but it really saturates up the red and the magenta. So there's enriched, here's normal, there's enriched. The skin detail function applies a slight blur to anything that it considers skin detail. For example, this is with it off, and this is with it on. What you'll notice is that in the wrinkles and the imperfections, there's a very, very subtle blurring effect that happens that can help hide skin imperfections. The skin detail function is a very subtle effect, and it's also dependent on the setting on your overall detail level. The lower the detail level is set, the less detail there is for skin detail to smooth out. The higher the detail level is set, the more that skin detail function will show an effect. These clips were shot at detail level of +7. So if you're trying to use it on footage where you have a very low overall detail level, you really won't see any difference at all. V detail frequency is a setting that controls how the camera deals with thin horizontal lines. Horizontal lines being the more you could stack together into a vertical bit of space is the more resolution you can get. In this resolution chart, we're using thick line mode. Let me swatch over to thin line mode. You see there's a lot more detail in the little horizontal wedges, but they're flickering, very noticeable flickering. This is an artifact that comes about because of interlaced televisions. And a compromise that almost every interlaced camera ever made has introduced has been to add this vertical blur filter that does the same thing as thick line detail does. It blurs the lines together a little bit, spreads them out across the fields, lowers resolution, but also gets rid of the flickering. When you're looking at the highest resolution the camera can offer, thin line detail offers the most resolution. This mode is most suitable for display on a progressive device like transfer to film, display on an LCD TV, perhaps on a computer monitor. You'll see the highest resolution the camera can deliver when you're in thin line mode. But on a TV, it makes for some annoying flickering, so they provided for thick line detail. Now, thick line detail is always the standard when you're in interlaced mode. You can never get thin line detail in interlaced mode. It's always thick. You only get thin line detail in progressive scan, and even then only if you want it. If you're shooting for a television, you might choose thick line detail to avoid the potential for flickering lines, even though it does mean you'll be getting lower resolution. DVX100A adds a new option called mid. And what mid does is mid retains a lot of the resolution of thin line detail, but reduces the flickering a little bit. There's more flickering here on thin than there is here on mid. It's still a compromise, and you might find mid appropriate in scenes where the thin offers a little bit too much flicker. You'll get a little more resolution with thin. You can see that we get about into 550 lines worth of resolution that is still clearly resolved on thin line detail, depending on how good your monitor is, whether you can see that. Whereas in mid, you lose a little bit of that. It comes back to about 475 is about where it's still clear, 450, 475. Whereas if you go all the way back to thick, you have to drop down to maybe about 350, 360 before the lines start to converge. So you get about 360 lines on thick line detail, you get about 550 lines on thin line detail, but you get the most flicker on an interlaced TV with thin line detail. And with mid, it's about the middle. You get about 450, 475 lines of resolution and a little bit less flicker, but it does still.
When new users pick up the DVX for the first time, they switch it over to 24p mode, wave the camera around, and then say, "Hey, wait a minute, what's all this strobing?" There's a very different look between 24p and traditional video, also known as 60i. In 24p, the camera shoots 24 frames every second. In regular 60i video, the camera shoots 60 half frames per second. The difference is dramatic. The 24p footage looks more like a movie, and the 60i video looks more like a soap opera. But shooting only 24 frames per second has a side effect called strobing. Pan the camera or move it side to side too fast, and you might see choppy, stuttery movement. Strobing can be unpleasant to watch. Film cinematographers have been fighting this issue for almost 100 years and have developed two main rules to minimize strobing. First, pan the camera slowly. Exact rates are published in the guide that accompanies this DVD, but the general rule of thumb is to make sure that an object takes approximately 7 seconds to cross the screen. That's really slow, but it's what you need to do if you want smooth motion. The other rule is that you can move much quicker if you put something stationary in the foreground for the eye to follow. This gives the viewer's eye something to focus on other than the strobing background. The background is strobing just as much, but the viewer doesn't notice it because they're watching the subject. Why does it strobe? To understand this, you have to understand the difference between 24p and 60i. With 24p, the camera shutter is only open for half the time, but in 60i, the shutter is always open. In 60i, the camera shoots 60 fields per second, and each field is exposed for 1/60th of a second, so the camera's eye is always open, always recording motion. But with 24p, the camera captures 24 frames per second, and each frame is exposed for half that time, or 1/48th of a second. This means that the camera's eye is shut half the time. In 60i, it's always open, but in 24p, it's open-closed, open-closed. So the motion strobes just like a strobe light. Film works the same way. So, is this strobing a good thing or a bad thing? Obviously, it makes motion more choppy, but if you want your footage to look like film, it's a necessary effect. Although some people say that film doesn't strobe like the DVX does, we decided to find out. We strapped a DVX to a 16mm camera and mounted them both on a tripod, and shot the same exact scene side by side. As you can tell, the DVX renders motion the same way film does. What this means for you is, if you find the strobing objectionable, the camera's not at fault. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. You need to adapt your technique to follow the American Society of Cinematographer rules for shooting film. Slow down your pans and follow a subject. Disobey the rules and your footage will strobe, exactly like film does. There are two ways you can lessen the strobing effect. First, using a longer shutter speed will give you a little more motion blur. Film cameras use shutter speeds anywhere between 1/40th and 1/60th of a second. Faster shutter speeds mean sharper footage and more strobing. Slower shutter speeds mean more motion blur and slightly less strobing. The second thing you can do is increase your frame rate. Shooting at 30p will get 25% more frames per second, which will mean less strobing. Your footage will look a little more like video, but still look sort of film-like. 30p can't be transferred to film or to PAL television, but if you're bothered by the strobing in 24p, you may find 30p more to your liking. Or, you can always shoot at 60i and completely eliminate strobing, but your shots will look like video instead of film. But that's one of the great things about the DVX. You can shoot at different frame rates and choose the frame rate that you like best.
The DVX has 4x3 CCDs, designed to match the shape of a regular television, but many shooters want the widescreen look. People like the look of 16:9, but the vast majority of televisions are still 4x3. What's the best way to get the widescreen look from your camera? The DVX offers two ways, and the DVX100A even offers a third option. How do you know which to choose? To find the answer, you have to answer a different question. What do you intend to display your footage on? If it's going to be shown on a standard 4x3 television, the best and easiest way to get the widescreen look is to shoot in letterbox mode. Letterbox just adds black bars over your 4x3 video, like a letterboxed movie. If you're displaying your work on a widescreen television, you have to change the shape of your video to be widescreen. You have two options: optically by using the Panasonic anamorphic adapter, or if you have a DVX100A, you can get the widescreen digitally by using squeeze mode. The anamorphic adapter is a specially designed lens that optically squeezes a wide screen into your camera, and then when it's displayed on a widescreen TV, the shape of the TV stretches the image back out to be widescreen. This is the highest quality way to get 16:9 footage from a DVX camera. It uses the whole surface of the CCD to record the video. It basically transforms your camera into one that shoots native 16:9. The other option is to use squeeze mode, which chops off the top and bottom of the image and then digitally stretches the image vertically. Then when the image gets displayed on a widescreen TV, the shape of the TV causes the image to get stretched out horizontally, giving you a widescreen picture. Because squeeze mode only uses 75% of the potential resolution and uses digital resizing to stretch the image, a squeeze mode picture is lower in resolution than the anamorphic adapter would provide. But it'll still be the highest resolution an interlaced TV can safely display without flicker. And squeeze mode is free, whereas the anamorphic adapter costs about $850. Is it worth it? We'll let you decide. These clips are meant to be viewed on a widescreen monitor. The footage on the left was shot in squeeze mode. The footage on the right was shot using the anamorphic adapter. These are blow-ups of resolution charts showing the difference between the anamorphic adapter and squeeze mode. The anamorphic adapter is quite higher in resolution. The higher resolution definitely shows up on a transfer to film or a large screen television, but may not be seen as noticeable on a smaller screen. In summary, if you want a widescreen look and you're shooting for a 4x3 television, use letterbox mode. If you're shooting for a widescreen television and you like the look of squeeze mode, go ahead and use it. It's free and built into the camera. If you want the highest resolution possible, the anamorphic adapter is the way to go.
Now available from Kirby Brothers Productions at www.kbproducts.com, Fight Scenes for Motion Pictures, the ultimate tutorial DVD on performing and capturing exciting fight sequences. This comprehensive instructional DVD is designed to benefit the aspiring stuntman and filmmaker alike. You'll learn valuable information on everything from the basics of learning how to fall to some of Hollywood's best tricks on making dynamic fights for the movies. Fight Scenes for Motion Pictures, now available at www.kbproducts.com.